Okay, so today we're going to do more with our equilibrium analysis. So we're going to do more with our equilibrium analysis. So we're going to answer, or at least try to answer, some questions about what the role of prices are in society, how they work, what they mean, and all kinds of other things. We're also going to be critically evaluating some policy proposals, or some generic policy proposals, I should say. And we're going to ask the question, like, what do they accomplish? Now, some of this is going to sound exceedingly political, and so what I want to do is first give you a discussion of normative and positive. Okay, so a normative statement, a normative, or things that are normative, are things that say ought or should. So normative statements will contain the words ought or should, right? So, we should go to the beach, right? That is a normative statement. We should eat pizza. You ought not do that, right? These are normative statements. They are, at some level, they're untestable, right? So we cannot use, science to determine whether or not we should go to the beach today. Like, there's no scientific consensus on that sort of thing. We can't, test that conclusion. There's no possible way that we could even imagine testing that conclusion. A positive statement, you can consider a positive statement to be sort of a if blank, then blank statement. All right, they are testable. Right, so if I drink coffee, then I will feel more alert. Right, if I take ibuprofen, then my back won't ache as much. Right, those are positive statements. But the statement I should take ibuprofen is a normative statement. Right, so if I want my back to not hurt, then take ibuprofen. Right, or if I take ibuprofen, then my back will not hurt. Right, I should or I ought to take ibuprofen. Those are two different statements. Okay, so economics is a positive science. It may have normative conclusions, but it is a positive science nonetheless. Okay, so let's do sort of an example of this. And so way back in the day, right? Adam Smith, a guy named Adam Smith and David Hume, were once arguing about state-sponsored religion. With Adam Smith, Smith was pro separation of church and state, right? He was against using tax dollars to pay for the church. Okay, and David Hume, his good friend, was very much pro using tax dollars to pay for church. Okay, so Adam Smith was against using tax dollars to pay for church. David Hume was for it. And so they argued back and forth for a long time. And at one point, Adam Smith basically writes a letter to David Hume saying, David, you know that when we use tax dollars to pay for something, the quality of the product goes down and the cost of the product goes up. Right? So basically, Adam Smith was saying that when we use taxpayer dollars to do something, it ends up being low quality and expensive. Okay? And so let's for now, let's assume that that's true, or at least it was true in the 1750s when these people were arguing, okay? Let's just assume that that's true. And David Hume said, yes, exactly. That's why I am pro using tax dollars to pay for church, right? And Adam Smith wrote back to him and said, well, what the hell, right? You can't possibly be for using tax dollars to pay for church if it's going to make the thing more expensive and lower quality. What's going on? And so David Hume said, David Hume, as it turns out, was very much anti-religion, and Adam Smith was pro-religion. And so Adam Smith wanted to see religion flourish. David Hume wanted to see it fail, right? And so both of them agreed on the statement, if we use tax dollars, then low quality and high cost, right? So both of them agreed here, okay, but they disagreed on the normative part. So they agreed on the positive analysis. If we use tax dollars, then low quality and high cost will result, right? They disagreed on the normative part, right? Adam Smith believed that religion was good, and so he thought that everyone should be religious, right? And so he opposed using taxpayer dollars because he wanted the church to be high quality and low cost. Okay? David Hume thought religion was a terrible thing, right? He thought religion was bad, and so he wanted to see less of it, and so he said that we should use taxpayer dollars because if we use taxpayer dollars, then low quality, good, and high cost, right? So both of them agreed here, they disagreed here, okay? We are going to focus in this class exclusively on the positive, right? The normative stuff is a separate issue. This is a positive class, so we'll talk about things like the minimum wage and rent control today and a few other things, right? And we're going to approach them in a positive way. You can have different normative judgments than me, and that's totally fine. I'm not grading you at all on this. I am, however, grading you on this, okay? This is where this class is. We are not doing normative stuff. We can talk about it if you want, so feel free to leave comments or shoot me an email or come into office hours. We can talk about the normative stuff, but in class, it is a positive class, okay? So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's get into the actual material, okay? And so last time, we learned a lot about the role of supply and demand and what's going on, right? So we learned a really valuable lesson that, you know, basically when the price of something goes up, it doesn't necessarily mean that the store or a corporation is trying to get more money out of you, right? It could very easily be the case that there is something else going on that you're not aware of, which is what's making the price change and also alters your behavior. And so some examples of this, one example of this is the reduced number of vacations after Katrina. All right, so Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast a few years ago, and we can illustrate that in supply and demand, right, for gasoline. Okay, so Hurricane Katrina hits, destroyed a whole bunch of gas refineries, which resulted in fewer gas stations or gas refineries existing for at least a little bit, decreasing the supply of gas and driving up the price. All right, I should have put this stuff in. and decreasing the quantity, right? And so because of the higher price of gas, a lot of people in, let's say, the northern states did not drive or fly down to the southern states for vacation, right? But, and that sounds bad. We say, oh man, it's so sad that these people didn't get to take a vacation. But because there was less gas available for everyone, the gas actually got allocated to its higher valued uses. So there was more gasoline available for things like rescue helicopters, fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars, right? And so you're right to say that it's a shame that these people didn't get to take their vacations. By not doing so, they left gas available for things like fire trucks, right? Or let's think about a different example, perhaps a more positive example. So let's pretend right now that we have the market for plastic. Okay. And so we have the market for plastic. And let's pretend that Coca-Cola, is the only buyer. Okay. And then the hospital or the medical field discovers that plastic would help them save lives. Okay. And so we have, Coca-Cola is using plastic to make their plastic, bottles of soda. And then the hospitals discover that plastic helps to save lives. And so we can say that D1 is the demand for plastic for Coke. S1 is just the supply curve for plastic. And so now we have another buyer, which is going to increase the demand. Okay. And so D2 is the demand for both Coke and the hospital. Okay. And so let's think about what we would want the world or society to do in this example. Okay, so if Coke is the only buyer of plastic and hospitals discover that plastic helps to save lives, then we might have two goals that we want to accomplish. The first one would be increase the amount of plastic available. Okay, so we want there to be more plastic. We want the plastic companies to make more plastic, right? So they can have some for the hospital. And we'd also want Coke to reduce the amount of plastic that they use. And let's pretend that Coca-Cola is just an evil mega corporation and they have absolutely no regard for human life whatsoever, right? So they're just the meanest people. Now, this is obviously not true. Coke is a very generous company, but let's pretend that they're evil, okay? And let's see if if prices, so the question we're asking is, are prices alone enough to allocate resources, quote unquote, well? Okay, so will prices alone accomplish this goal, these two goals? Okay, well, we can see that because the price is going to increase at the new equilibrium, right? So the price went up, and as a result, the quantity increased. So did we accomplish the first goal? Yes. Big check mark. Okay. So we accomplished the goal, increasing the amount of plastic available. But what about the second goal? Well, for here, we need to realize a really clever trick. This demand curve, D2, is the demand for both Coke and the hospital. And this demand curve here is the demand curve for just Coke. And so at the new price, we can come straight over to where we hit the old demand curve. And we'll discover that Coca-Cola actually reduced their consumption, right? They used to be consuming Q1, but at a new price P2, they now consume only Q3. And so in reality, the price increasing just by itself was enough to accomplish both of these goals, both increasing the amount of plastic available and decreasing the amount of plastic that Coca-Cola uses. And so the true power of prices lies in allocating resources in a way that actually seems like it benefits society, right? We have less plastic being used for Coke and more plastic available for the hospital, right? And so the key here is to recognize that just because prices are going up doesn't necessarily mean that people are taking advantage of you or doing anything like that, right? But it could be. So let's talk about perhaps a different example. So let's talk about natural disaster. So let's say that we are in Joplin, Missouri a few years ago when an F5 tornado hit. Okay, so what about natural disasters? Okay, so Joplin, Missouri, tornado hits, right? What's going on here? Okay, so let's do the demand or the market for lumber. Okay. Or actually, let's switch to Hurricane Katrina because I have a better story for this one. It's a little bit more interesting. So let's say this is Hurricane Katrina. This is New Orleans, just before Hurricane Katrina hits, or sometime before rather, and this is the market for lumber. And then Hurricane Katrina hits, and destroys thousands of homes, right? And uproots millions of people. It's a terrible, awful tragedy. Okay. We would illustrate this as the demand for lumber increasing because now everybody wants to buy more lumber. And so the equilibrium price and quantity are both going to increase. So let's call this New Orleans, Louisiana, right? Now at the time, I was in college, and so I had joined a fraternity, and we were thinking about building a deck on our house. Okay. Oh, yep. Okay, so we were thinking about adding a deck onto our house because if there's one thing that drunk 19-year-olds can do, it's construct a deck, right? That's to code and safe for everybody. So, obviously, we were going to do that, right? And so we priced it out, and it turned out that we could afford it. So we drove off to the hardware store to pick up the lumber, right? And when we got to the hardware store, we found that lumber was significantly more expensive, okay? Why? So this is lumber in Michigan. Okay. Why would lumber be more expensive in Michigan? Well, so it turns out we consider lumber in Michigan and lumber in New Orleans to be alternative products. So even though it's the same piece of wood, if it's in New Orleans, it is a different product than a piece of wood in Michigan, right? Even if it's the exact same piece of wood. If it's in New Orleans, it is different from being in Michigan. And so what happened to the price of this alternative product, right? It went up. And so as a result, the supply curve for lumber in Michigan had actually decreased, right? Which had caused the equilibrium price of lumber in Michigan to increase as well. So the equilibrium price of lumber in Michigan increased, and the equilibrium quantity of lumber in Michigan also decreased, right? And the reason why is very simple. Companies or lumber yards rerouted their shipments that were going to Michigan to New Orleans because they knew that the price had gone up there and they wanted to sell the wood there. And so because of that, the price of wood in Michigan also rose because we weren't getting as much lumber as we used to. Okay? And the cool thing is that because of this, the quantity of wood available in New Orleans increased because the quantity of wood in Michigan decreased. So we had people in Michigan effectively giving up buying the wood so that the people of New Orleans could. Now the crazy thing is that Hurricane Katrina hit prior to the rise of smartphones, and I was in a very small town in Michigan, and so getting the news just wasn't a thing that I really did at 19 years old, right? And so I had no idea that Hurricane Katrina had even hit. I was living under a rock at the time. And I still sacrificed building a deck so that other people in New Orleans could have a house, right? And, as a person, so this is not as a professor, I would find it fairly true that someone else having a house is more important than a frat boy having a deck, right? In terms of which one is better for society. But that's me speaking as a person, not as your economics professor, okay? And so, but notice what happens. So I'm talking about this and glorifying this change right here, okay? But lots of people vilify this, right? So the people of New Orleans were very upset that they had just gotten, and people around the country, as a matter of fact, were very upset that the people of New Orleans had just been hit by a hurricane, and then they got hit by higher prices at the store. And we call this price gouging. Or they call it price gouging, I should say, right? Where price gouging is essentially taking advantage of a disaster to raise prices and therefore profits. Right? This is how the media defines price gouging, how people that are opposed to price gouging typically define it. Right? So people do not like price gouging. They do not like this. But let's see what happens when we when we perhaps restrict prices. Okay, so let's see what ends up happening, and we'll come back and apply it here. Okay, so first thing that we want to do is talk about sort of the effect of price controls or price fixes. And the basic idea is that the market produces the wrong price, and therefore we need to step in and fix this. Okay? And so typically we say that the market would produce a price that is wrong. It's either too high or it's too low. Okay? And so let's start thinking about some of those cases where we see them, or we at least claim to see them. So the most common example of a price that is believed to be too low is the price of labor. Right? So most people say that left to the market's own devices, so the forces of supply and demand, the market will produce a minimum wage or wage for these workers of, let's say, $5 an hour, right? And at $5 an hour, the fast food industry, etc., will employ, let's say, 100 people. Okay, and we say, there's no way that anyone could ever live off of $5 an hour, right? Andrew Cuomo of New York City recently said that we need to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which is the equivalent of about $30,000 a year, and it will raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and that will give people enough money to live off of. Okay, and so the way we would draw this is we would just increase the price to 15, and we draw a line. And we note that at $15 per hour, the quantity demanded is down here. Let's say it's 50, whereas the quantity supplied is, let's say, 200. Okay, and so we have a case where quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, which, as we knew before, was an excess supply. But now, because this $15 minimum wage is binding, which means we cannot price below $15, this excess supply will persist. So because the minimum wage is binding, the excess supply will persist, which we call a surplus. So a surplus is an excess supply that persists, or it is a persistent excess supply. Okay? And in the context of labor, or this is the business or the firms, and these are the workers. In the context of labor, we call a surplus of labor unemployment. Okay, so one of the tendencies of raising the minimum wage is that the unemployment rate will increase, right? Because we have made labor more expensive, businesses will buy less of it. But because the wage is higher, more people will want to work, right? And that will tend to raise unemployment, right? And in this case, we call the minimum wage a price floor, right? Because it is typically a legal, but doesn't always have to be legal. It is a legal minimum price. Minimum price. Right? It is illegal to charge a price lower than the minimum wage or lower than the price floor. So the reason why we call it a price floor is because there will be downward pressure, right? Just like we talked about with the excess supply, there will be downward pressure on the price, but it won't be allowed to go beneath it. Just like how you can stomp your foot on the floor and not go through it, right? You can put all the downward pressure you want on your floor and you will not go beneath it, right? The other side is a case where the price is believed to be too high, right? So one example of this is rent, right? So a few years ago, there was a candidate running for some office in New York whose platform was that the rent was too damn high, right? And so let's say rent in New York City is $2,000, and let's say 10,000 people can live there, right? Can live there comfortably. And so the guy says the rent is too damn high, and so what he wants to do is pass a law that says that the rent can only be, let's say, $500 per month, and that will in turn give $1,500 per month back to the consumer that they can then go off and spend, and this will increase economic development and blah, 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 right? All kinds of stuff. And by the way, we'll talk about that part, that last bit, later on in this semester. But let's just go through it and see what happens. Let's go through just his one idea. So we lower the rent to $500, and we find that at $500, fewer landlords are willing to rent out their property. Right? And by the way, keep in mind that these curves are saying if quality stays the same. So we'll talk about that. So this is fewer people are willing to let someone live in their house for $500 than they were for $2,000. So let's say that this reduces the number of houses available to 5,000. And let's just call this QD, and I'll just extend that line. But at $500, let's say 25,000 people want to rent a place in New York City, right? So we have a case where the quantity demand exceeds the quantity supply, which we know as an excess demand. So there will be upward pressure on the price, right? But it won't be able to go up. And so the excess demand will persist and become a shortage. Okay? Where a shortage is a persistent excess demand. And so in this case, in the market for homes, this sounds a lot like homelessness. So one of the consequences of rent controls in New York City is that there are fewer homes available because the price has gone down, and there are more people that want to rent them because the price has gone down. Well, when there's more people that want to live in a place than there are places to stay, that's going to be an increase in homelessness. And economists have taken to calling a legal maximum price a price ceiling, which is a legal maximum price. Okay, in the sense that it is the maximum price that is allowed to be sold or charged. Okay, and so here we have a price ceiling, which is on the bottom, and before we had a price floor, which was on the top. Okay, so if you want to remember something very simple, an easy way to remember this, just remember that economists make or build upside down houses. Right? We would put the floor on top and the ceiling on the bottom. Right? So our houses look like this, right? Which is not the way you want a house to look. So do not hire an economist to build your house. Okay? And so what we see here are cases where price controls might end up leading to the very thing that they want to prevent or not cause. Other things that we see are other unintended consequences. And so unintended consequences, right, which we defined last time, but once again briefly, are any consequences of a policy or an action that were not intentional, that run counter to what it is that we want to accomplish. So in the case of rent control, it leads to homelessness, but other unintended consequences, right, for rent control, we have fewer houses available, or apartments, more likely. Right? We see smaller units, right? So people, if the maximum that you were allowed to charge is $500 for one unit, and you used to have a unit that was worth $2,000, one way to solve that is to make the one unit into 4 smaller units, right? And divide up the rooms into multiple rooms, and thus you can get back to $2,000. So you get smaller units. We also see things called key fees, which is to say that your landlord might rent you the apartment for $500, but they're going to charge you $1,500 per month to rent the key to get into the building, right? You can also think of they'll include furniture, which you must rent at an exorbitant price, right, to get around the rent control. Or we'll see people calling the obituaries, the obits, right? They'll call people whose names are in the obituary and try to rent apartments that way, right? Because the apartments are flying off the market very quickly because they are underpriced. And so people look through the obituary section to find apartments that are up for rent. And so the important thing to realize, right, and with these unintended consequences, or the idea behind unintended consequences, is that intentions do not equal results, right? Obviously, Andrew Cuomo wants to have people make more money, which is a great goal, right? No one, as a normative statement, no one should be opposed to people making more money, okay? But an unintended consequence, which I'm sure Andrew Cuomo doesn't want to happen, is that people will have a harder time finding jobs, okay? And the rent is too damn high guy wants to make rent more affordable, right? But he doesn't want these things to happen, okay? So these are unintended consequences. These people intend to do one thing, but the result is a different thing, okay? So a lot of times, what people will say is that or another way to think about this is the following, right? To oppose a policy is not the same as opposing its goals. So it's possible that someone could vote against, let's say, increasing public education funding and still be pro-education, right? That's totally possible, right? It doesn't mean that those are mutually exclusive positions. So if you keep these things in mind, right, you will always find that the world is much more peaceful than otherwise. Now, another way to think about this, so let's do one more example that we could think about, right? So Let's pretend that this is you, right? And you're happy because you have your college degree and you're making all the money and you want a pool. You want to build a swimming pool. And you can hire College Kids Inc. Right? These college kids, they are sad because they're still in college and they're not making as much money as you are. Not to say that money means happiness, but they're not as happy as you are. And let's say you have to pay each one of them $10 each, all right? Or you can hire me, right? And I am a fat cat businessman who makes lots of money using digging pools using my excavator, or as I call it, a steam shovel, but that is evidently a very old name, and the new name is excavator. So here is my excavator. You can also tell that I passed art class with a B+. Right? So we'll make my legs equal length, right? And so here we are. And I cost, let's say I cost $100, right? And let's say the pools are identical. Okay, and so you will never know the difference between whether College Kids Inc. does it or whether, let's say, Dave Co. does it, right? You will never know the difference, okay? And all you care about is charging or getting it for the least price. Well, you should probably go with College Kids Inc. because these guys will only cost you $50 and I'll cost you $100, okay? But then I turn angry, right? And I turn to you and I say, how dare you? How dare you only pay college kids $10 each for your swimming pool, right? That's nowhere near a living wage. They're in debt. They need to pay for their tuition, pay off their loans, have something to eat that's above ramen noodles. This is just, you are oppressing them with such a low wage of $10. You should give them all at least $30. And so I go to my local politician or my local government, and I get a $30 minimum wage for pool workers passed. And so now these people, these combined 5 people, they don't cost $50, they cost $150. And now what happens is you switch to buying me at $100 because I am cheaper than these 5 kids, right? But what you'll also find is that I have raised my price to $149. And if I'm really persnickety, $149.99. And so, even though I lobbied to get these people more money, I'm the one that got more money, right? And this is basically, if you've seen Judge Judy, this is the idea of don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining. But what I'm trying to say here is that this stuff right here happens more often than you may be aware of. And so if you learn economics well, if you study it hard and you really master it, right, you will start to see this stuff all around you. And so I don't want to spoil any more for you, but this happens a lot more often than people are aware of. And studying economics is the subject that allows you to sort of see it. All right. We have an exam next week, so I'll let you go, and you can go study for that. Please feel free to contact me with any questions or anything like that.